We all know nutrition plays a role in fiber growth, and this is something that I think is pretty cool. When we think about the way to manipulate fiber growth to either increase it or decrease it, we have all seen some of these trends. Some really cool work done out of Australia across the country. They replicated it across something like 20 to 30 different ranches, and they basically fed a group of ewes at this ranch at maintenance or made their baseline requirements, and then fed the rest of the ewes about 25% less of what they should have been getting, okay? And then they looked at the offspring of those ewes clear up to 6 years. And they measured everything under the sun. From a researcher perspective, it was pretty cool. But I just took a little part of that paper, and what we saw is those ewes that were fed sub-maintenance versus those ewes that were fed to meet their requirements were also about a half a pound difference in terms of their clean wool production. Now I realize a lot of us probably don't have sheep out on a sagebrush steppe, but chances are if we're evaluating an individual fleece, what a Columbia ewe on the range would be expected to shear should be drastically different than what we would see in a farm flock. Not drastically different, but a pound to a half a pound. Some of the nutrients that if you've worked with me before, you understand that I'm a big advocate or proponent of good trace mineral nutrition, okay? And one of the nutrients that we work a ton with here at the University of Wyoming is zinc, okay? We've determined, and also internationally it's been determined, that if we feed a good mineral, especially a good mineral with zinc, we can increase the rate of growth in the fibers we're dealing with, okay? I realize that this is a little bit hard to see, but we had a control group where we fed them the recommended levels of zinc, or what the scientists currently recommend, and then we doubled those requirements with 2 different sources of zinc in a mineral. Not too important for this discussion. But we saw a pretty important fiber length difference across that 80-day period, and extrapolating that out over a year, those ewes, or those ram lambs, in this study, that got extra zinc produced almost a half of inch of staple length compared to those that were fed the recommended levels, okay? Now obviously I encourage everyone to work with nutritionists, a good sheep nutritionist that understands the importance of these nutrients for fiber growth, but there's opportunities to manipulate that even more. Even more important than the trace minerals like copper and zinc, it's the amino acids, right? All protein that we always analyze as crude protein in our feeds is made up of amino acids. And so some of those essential amino acids that really promote fiber growth are methionine and cysteine. Now if you go to the feed store and ask for methionine and cysteine, they will give you a blank look, I promise, okay? But what we have found is, generally speaking, those proteins that have a high amount of bypass value, like some of our meals, soybean meal, cottonseed meal, those extruded byproducts, have a high amount of those essential amino acids that are absorbed more efficiently in the small intestine versus just feeding a high crude protein diet, okay? So if you really wanted to manipulate and increase fiber growth, feeding some bypass proteins, soybean meal, cottonseed meal, distillers is a good source for that as well. I put up this picture here because, again, I realize that with this group, all of us come from different parts of the country. I work in Wyoming, and as you can tell, we get tons of precipitation. So we see that we don't always have those nutrients available, and something that I see a lot more of when we're evaluating ewe lambs in the fall or we're evaluating fleeces on the shearing floor is I see a lot more copper deficiency out in my neck of the woods. Now before anyone strings me up by my toes and says, "What a dummy, don't you know copper is toxic in sheep diets?" I want to put out the disclaimer that sheep do have a copper requirement. It's very small. It's about 9 to 15 parts per million, okay? But if all they're getting is what is out on the native range, when we've sampled forages across all species, across multiple ranches, we do see a copper deficiency in a lot of our range ewes, okay? If you come from a farm flock or the Midwest where you have good access to byproducts, chances are that comment means nothing to you, okay? So don't misinterpret, but copper is important for wool growth, and it's worth testing your feeds to know where you're at. Obviously, we know if we get above 20, 25 parts per million, we start to see toxicity issues. But there is a requirement, and if we're not meeting it, we start to see this kind of transparent looking steely wool is what we call it. Okay, it's brittle, it feels coarser than the individual micron is.